Chapter 9 of Trailin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Rowdy Delaney, Idaho, USA. Trailin by Max Brand. Chapter 9. This Place for Rest. As the white heat of midday passed and the shadows lengthened more and more rapidly to the east, the sheep moved out from the shade and from the tangle of the brush to feed in the open, and the dogs, which had laid one on either side of the man, rose and trotted out to recommence their vigil. But the shepherd did not change his position where he sat cross-legged under the tree. Alternately he stroked the drooping mustache to the right and then the left, with a little twist each time, which turned the hair to a sharp point in its furthest downward reach near his chin. To the right, to the left, to the right, to the left, while his eyes, sad with the perpetual mist, looked over the lake and far away to the white tops of the Little Brothers, now growing blue with shadow. Finally, with a brown forefinger, he lifted the brush of mustache on his upper lip, leaned a little, and spat. After that he leaned back with a sigh of content. The brown juice had struck fairly and squarely on the center of the little stone which for the past 2 hours he had been endeavoring vainly to hit. The wind had been against him. All was well. The spindling tops of the second growth forest pointed against the pale blue of a stainless sky, and through that clear air the blatting of the most distant sheep sounded close, mingled with the light clangor of the bells. But the perfect peace was broken rudely now by the form of a horseman looming black and large against the eastern sky. He trotted his horse down the slope, scattered a group of noisy sheep from side to side before him, and drew rein before the shepherd. "Evening." "Evening, stranger." "Own this land?" "No, rent it." "Could I camp here?" The shepherd lifted his mustache again and spat. When he spoke his eyes held steadily and sadly on the little stone, which he had missed again. "Can't think of nobody who'd stop you." "That your house over there? You rent that?" He pointed to a broken-backed ruin which stood on the point of land that jutted out into the waters of the lake, a crumbling structure slowly blackening with time. "Nope." A shadow of a frown crossed the face of the stranger and was gone again more quickly than a cloud shadow brushed over the window on a windy city in March. "Well," he said, "this place looks pretty good to me. Ever fish those streams?" "Don't eat fish." "I'll wager you're missing some first-class trout, though. By Jove, I'd like to cast a couple times over some of the pools I've passed in the last hour. By the way, who owns that house over there?" "Same feller that owns the land." "That so? What's his name?" The other lifted his shaggy eyebrows and stared at the stranger. "Ain't been long around here, eh?" "No." "William Drew owns that house." "William Drew?" repeated the rider, as though imprinting the word in his memory. "Is he home?" "Maybe." "I'll ride over and ask him if he can put me up. Wait a minute. He may be home, but he lives on the other side of the range." "Very far from here?" "A piece." "How will I know him when I see him?" "Big feller, gray, broad shoulders." "Ah," the other murmured, and smiled as though the picture pleased him. "I'll hunt him up and ask him if I can camp out in this house of his for a while." "Well, that's your party." "Don't you think he'd let me?" "Maybe, but the house ain't lucky." "That so?" "Sure. There's a grave in front of it." "A grave? Whose?" "Dunno." "Well, it doesn't worry me. I'll drop over the hill and see Drew." "Maybe you better wait. You'll be passing him on the road like as not." "How's that?" "He comes over here on Tuesdays once a month. Tomorrow he's about due." "Good. In the meantime I can camp over there by that stream, hey?" "Don't know of nobody'd stop you." "By the way, what brings Drew over here every month?" "Never ask him. I was brung up not to ask questions." The stranger accepted this subtle rebuke with such an open, infectious laugh that the shepherd smiled in the very act of spitting at the stone, with the result that he missed it by whole inches. "I'll answer some of the questions you haven't asked, then. My name is Anthony Bard, and I'm out here seeing the mountains and having a bully time in general with my rod and gun." The sad eyes regarded him without interest, but Bard swung from his horse and advanced with outstretched hand. "I may be here a few days, and we might as well get acquainted, eh? I'll promise to lay off the questions." "I'm Logan." "Glad to know you, Mr. Logan." "Same to you. Don't happen to have no fine cut about you?" "No. Sorry." "So am I. Ran out, and now all I got is plug. Kind of hard on the teeth, and full of molasses. I've got some pipe tobacco, though, which might do." He produced a pouch, which Logan opened, taking from it a generous pinch. "Looks kind of like fine cut. Smells kind of like the real thing." Here he removed the quid from his mouth and introduced a great pinch of tobacco. "And I'll be damned if it don't taste a pile the same." The misty eyes centered upon Bard, and a light grew up in them. "Maybe you'd put a price on this tobacco, stranger?" "It's yours," said Bard, "to help forget all the questions I've asked." The shepherd acted at once, lest the other might change his mind, dumping the contents of the pouch into the breast pocket of his shirt. Afterward his gaze sought the dim summits of the Little Brothers, and a sad, great resolution grew up and hardened the lines of his sallow face. "You can camp with me if you want, partner." A cough, hastily summoned, covered Bard's smile. "Thanks awfully, but I'm used to camping alone, and I rather like it that way." "Which I'd say the same goes here," responded the shepherd with infinite relief. "I ain't got much use for company, away from a bar. But I could show you a pretty neat spot for a camp over there by the river." "Thanks, but I'll explore by myself." He swung again into the saddle and trotted whistling down the slope toward the creek which Logan had pointed out. But once fairly out of sight in the second growth forest, he veered sharply to the right, touched his tough cattle pony with his spurs, and headed at a racing pace straight for the old ruined house. Even from a distance the house appeared unmistakably done for, but not until he came close at hand could Bard appreciate the full extent of the ruin. Every individual board appeared to be rotting and crumbling toward the ground, awaiting the shake of one fierce gust of wind to disappear in a cloud of moldy dust. He left his horse with the reins hanging over its head behind the house and entered by the back door. One step past the threshold brought him misadventure. His foot drove straight through the rotten flooring, and his leg disappeared up to the knee. After that he proceeded more cautiously, following the lines of beams on which the boards were nailed, but even these shook and groaned under his weight. A whimsical fancy made him think of the fabled boat of Charon, which will float 1,000 bodiless spirits over the Styx, but which sinks to the waterline with the weight of a single human being. So he passed forward like one in a fabric of spider webs, almost fearing to breathe lest the whole house should puff away to shreds before him. Half the boards, fallen from the ceiling, revealed the bare rafters above. Below there were ragged holes in the flooring. In one place a limb, torn by lightning or wind from its overhanging tree, had crashed through a corner of the roof and dropped straight through to the ground. At last he reached a habitable room in the front of the house. It was a shell built inside the old wreck, with 4 stout corner posts supporting cross beams which in turn held up the moldering roof. In the center was a rude table, and on either side a bunk built against the wall. Perhaps this was where Drew lived on the occasion of his visits to the old ranch house. Out of the gloom of the place Bard stepped with a shrug of the shoulders, like one who shakes off the spell of a nightmare. He strode through the doorway and took the slant, warm sun of the afternoon full in his face. He found himself in front of the only spot on the entire premises which showed the slightest care, the mound of a grave under the shelter of 2 trees whose branches were interwoven overhead in some sort of impromptu roof. From the surface of the mound all weeds and grasses had been carefully cleared away, and around the edge ran a path covered with gravel and sand. It was a well-beaten path, with the marks of heels still comparatively fresh upon it. The headstone itself bore not a vestige of moss, but time had cracked it diagonally, and the chiseled letters were weathered away. He studied it with painful care, poring intently over each faint impression. He who cared for the grave had apparently been troubled only to keep the stone clean from dirt. The lettering he must have known by heart. At length Bard made out the inscription: Here lies Joan, wife of William Drew. She chose this place for rest. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Trailin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Rowdy Delaney, Idaho, USA. Trailin by Max Brand. Chapter 10. A Bit of Stalking. It seemed as if the peaceful afternoons of Logan were ended forever, for the next day the scene of interruption was repeated under almost identical circumstances, save that the tree under which the shepherds sat was a little larger. Larger also was the man who rode over the brow of the hill to the east. The most durable cattle pony would have staggered under the bulk of that rider, and therefore he rode a great patient-eyed bay, with shoulders worthy of shoving against a work collar. But the neck tapered down small behind a short head, and the legs, for all their breadth at shoulder and hip, slipped away to small hooves and ankles which sloped sharply to the rear, the sure sign of a fine saddle horse. Yet the strong horse was winded by the burden he bore, a mighty figure, deep-chested, ample-shouldered, an ideal cavalier for the days when youths rode out in armor plate to seek adventures, and when men of 50 still lifted the lance to run a friendly course or two in the lists. At the sight of him, Logan so far bestirred himself to uncoil his long legs, rise, and stand with one shoulder propped against the tree. "Evening, Mr. Drew," he called. "Hello, Logan. How's everything with you?" He would have ridden on, but at Logan's reply he checked his horse to a slow walk. "Busy. Lots of company lately, Mr. Drew." "Company?" "Yes. There's a young fellow come along who says he wants to see you. He's over there by the creek now, fishin', I think. I told him I'd holler if I seen you, but I guess you wouldn't mind ridin' over that way yourself." Drew brought his horse to a halt. "What does he want of me?" "Dunno. Something about wanting to hunt and fish on your streams here. Why didn't you tell him he was welcome to do what he liked? Must be an Easterner, Logan. Wants to bunk in the old house, too. Seems sort of interested in it." "That's so. What sort of fellow is he?" "All right. A bit talky. Green, but he rides damn well, and he smokes good tobacco." His hand automatically rose and touched his breast pocket. "I'll go over to him," said Drew, and swung his horse to the left, but only to come again to a halt. He called over his shoulder, "What sort of a lookin' fellow?" "Pretty keen, dark," answered Logan, slipping down into his original position. "Thin face, black eyes." "Ah, yes," murmured Drew, and started at a trot for the creek. Once more he imitated the actions of Bard the day before, however, for no sooner had the trees screened him thoroughly from the eyes of Logan than he abandoned his direct course for the creek. He swung from the saddle with an ease surprising in a man of such age and bulk, and tossed the reins over the head of the horse. Then he commenced a cautious stalking through the woods, silent as an Indian, stealthy of foot, with eyes that glanced sharply in all directions. Once a twig snapped underfoot, and after that he remained motionless through a long moment, shrinking against the trunk of a tree and scanning the forest anxiously in all directions. At length he ventured out again, grown doubly cautious. In this manner he worked his way up the course of the stream, always keeping the waters just within sight but never passing out on the banks, where the walking would have been tenfold easier. So he came in sight of a figure far off through the trees. If he had been cautious before, he became now as still as night. Dropping to his hands and knees, or crouching almost as prone, he moved from the shadow of one tree to the next, now and then venturing a glance to make sure that he was pursuing the right course, until he maneuvered to a point of vantage which commanded a clear view of Bard. The latter was fishing with his back to Drew. Again and again he cast the fly out under an overhanging limb which shadowed a deep pool. The big gray man set his teeth and waited with the patience of a stalking beast of prey, or a cat which will sit half the day, waiting for the mouse to show above the opening of its hole. Apparently there was a bite at length. The pole bent almost double, and the reel played back and forth rapidly as the fisher wore down his victim. Finally he came close to the edge of the stream, dipped his net into the water, and jerked it up at once, bearing a twisting, shining trout entrapped in the meshes. Swinging about as he did so, Drew caught his first full glimpse of Anthony's face, and knew him for the man who had ridden the wild horse at Madison Square Garden those weeks before. Perhaps it was astonishment that moved the big man. Surely it could not have been fear. Yet he knelt there behind the sheltering tree, gray-faced, wide, and blank of eye, as a man might look who dreamed and awoke to see his vision standing before him in full sunlit life. What his expression became then could not be said, for he buried his face in his hands, and his great body shook with a tremor. If this was not fear, it was something very like. And very like a man in fear, he stole back among the trees as cautiously as he had made his approach. Resuming his horse, he rode straight for Logan. "Couldn't find your young friend," he said, "along the creek." "Why?" said Logan. "I can reach him with a holler from here, I think." "Never mind. Just tell him he's welcome to do what he pleases on the place, and he can bunk down at the house if he wants to. I'd like to know his name, though." "That's easy. Anthony Bard." "Ah," said Drew slowly, "Anthony Bard." "That's it," nodded Logan, and fixed a curious eye upon the big gray rider. As if to escape from that inquiring scrutiny, Drew wheeled his horse and spurred a sharp gallop up the hill, leaving Logan frowning behind him. "No stay overnight?" muttered the shepherd. "No fooling about that damn old shack of a house? What's wrong with Drew?" He answered himself, for all shepherds are forced by the bitter loneliness of their work to talk to themselves. "That old boy's worried. Damned if he isn't. I'll keep an eye on this Bard feller." And he loosened the revolver in its holster. He might have been even more concerned had he seen the redoubled speed with which Drew galloped as soon as the hilltop was between him and Logan. Straight on he pushed his horse, not exactly like one who fled, but rather more like one too busy with consuming thoughts to pay the slightest heed to the welfare of his mount. It was a spent horse on which he trotted late that night up to the big yawning door of his barn. "Where's Nash?" he asked of the man who took his horse. "Playing a game with the boys in the bunkhouse, sir." So past the bunkhouse Drew went on his way to his dwelling, knocked, and threw open the door. Inside, a dozen men, seated at or standing around a table, looked up. "Nash!" "Here!" "On the jump, Nash. I'm in a hurry." There rose a man of a build much prized in pugilistic circles. In those same circles he would have been described as a fellow with a fighting face, and a heavyweight above the hips and a lightweight below. A handsome fellow, except that his eyes were a little too small and his lips a trifle too thin. He rose now in the midst of a general groan of dismay, and scooped up a considerable stack of gold, as well as several bright piles of silver. He was undoubtedly taking the glory of the game with him. "Is this square?" growled one of the men, clenching a fist on the edge of the table. The sardonic smile hardened on the lips of Nash as he answered: "Before you've been here much longer, Pete, you'll find out that about everything I do is square. Sorry to leave you boys before you're broke, but orders is orders." "But one more hand first," pleaded Pete. "You poor fool," snarled Nash. "Do you think I'd take a chance on keeping him waiting?" The last of his winnings passed with a melodious jingle into his pockets, and he went hurriedly out of the bunkhouse and up to the main building. There he found Drew in the room which the rancher used as an office, and stood at the door, hat in hand. "Come in. Sit down," said him. "Been taking the money away from the boys again, Steve? I thought I talked with you about that a month ago." "It's this way, Mr. Drew," explained Nash. "With me, stayin' away from the cards is like a horse stayin' off his feed. Besides, I done the square thing by the lot of those shorthorns." "What's that?" "I showed 'em my hand." "Told them you were a professional gambler?" "Sure. I explained they didn't have no chance against me." "And of course that made them throw every cent they had against you." "Maybe." "It can't go on, Nash." "Look here, Mr. Drew, I told 'em that I wasn't a gambler, but just a gold digger." The big man could not restrain his smile, though it came like a shadow of mirth rather than the sunlight. After all, they might as well lose to you as to someone else." "Sure," grinned Nash. "It keeps it in the family, eh?" "But one of these days, Steve, crooked cards will be the end of you." "I'm still pretty fast on the draw," Steve said sullenly. "All right, that's your business. Now I want you to listen to some of mine." "Real work?" "Your own line." "That," said Nash, with a smile of infinite meaning, "sounds like the dinner bell to me. Let her go, sir." End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Trailin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Rowdy Delaney, Idaho, USA. Trailin by Max Brand. Chapter 11. The Quest Begins. "You know the old place on the other side of the range? Like a book. I got pet names for all the trees. There's a man there I want. Logan? No, his name is Bard. Any relation to the old bird that was partners with you back about the year one?" "I want Anthony Bard brought here," said Drew, entirely overlooking the question. "Easy. I can make the trip in a buckboard, and I'll dump him in the back of it." "No, he's got to ride here, understand?" "A dead man," said Nash calmly, "ain't much good on a hoss." "Listen to me," Drew said, his voice lowering to a musical thunder. "If you harm a hair on this lad's head, I'll break you in two with my own hands." And then he made a significant gesture, as if he were snapping a twig between his fingers. Nash moistened his lips, then his square, powerful jaw jutted out. "Which the general idea is me doing baby talk and sort of hypnotizing this Bard fella into coming along?" "More than that. He's got to be brought here alive, untouched, and placed in that chair, tied so he can't move a hand or foot for 10 minutes while I talk." "Nice quiet day you've got planned for me, Mr. Drew." The gray man considered thoughtfully. "Now and then you've told me of a girl at Eldara. I think her name is Sally Fortune." "Right. She begins where the rest of the calico leaves off." That sounds familiar somehow." "Well, Steve, you've said that if you had a good start, you think the girl would marry you." "I think she might." "She pretty fond of you?" "She knows that if I can't have her, I'm fast enough to keep everyone else away." "I see. A process of elimination, with you as the eliminator. Rather an odd courtship, Steve?" The cowpuncher grew deadly serious. "You see, I love her. There ain't no way of bucking out of that. So do 9 out of 10 of all the boys that have seen her. Which one will she pick? That's the question we all keep asking, because of all the contrary, freckle-faced devils with the heart of a man and the smile of a woman, Sally has 'em all beat from the drop of the barrier. One feller has money, another has looks, another has a funny line of talk, but I've got the fastest gun. So Sally sees she's due for a complete outfit of black mournin' if she marries any other man while I'm alive, and that keeps her thinkin'. But if I had the price of a start in the world, why, maybe she'd take a long look at me. Would she call $1,000 in cash a start in the world, and your job as foreman of my place with twice the salary you have now?" Steve Nash wiped his forehead. He said huskily, "A joke along this line don't bring no laugh from me, Governor." "I mean it, Steve. Get Anthony Bard tied hand and foot into this house so I can talk to him safely for 10 minutes, and you'll have everything I promise. Perhaps more, but that depends." The blunt-fingered hand of Nash stole across the table. "If it's a go, shake, Mr. Drew." A mighty hand fell into his, and under the pressure he set his teeth. Afterwards he covertly moved his fingers and sighed with relief to see that no permanent harm had been done. "Me speakin' personal, Mr. Drew, I'd 'a give a lot to seen you when you was ridin' the range. This Bard, he'll be here before sunset tomorrow." "Don't jump to conclusions, Steve. I've an idea that before you count your 1,000 you'll think you've been underpaid. That's straight. This Bard's something of a man?" I can say that without stopping to think. Texas? No, he's a tenderfoot, but he can ride a horse as if he was sewed to the skin, and I've an idea he can do other things up to the same standard. If you can find 2 or 3 men who have silent tongues and strong hands, you'd better take them along. I'll pay their wages, and big ones. You can name your price." But Nash was frowning. "Now and then I talk to the cards a bit, Mr. Drew, and you'll hear fellers say some pretty rough things about me. But I've never asked for no odds against any man, and I'm not going to start now. You're a hard man, Steve, but so am I, and hard men are the kind I take to. I know that you're the best foreman who ever rode this range, and I know that when you start things you generally finish them. All that I ask is that you bring Bard to me in this house. The way you do it is your own problem, drunk or drugged, I don't care, but get him here, unharmed. Understand? Mr. Drew, you can start figuring what you're going to say to him now. I'll get him here, safe, and then Sally, if money will buy her, you'll have me behind you when you bid. When shall I start?" "Now." "So long, then." He rose and passed hastily from the room, leaning forward from his hips like a man who is making a start in a foot race. Straight up the stairs he went to his room, for the foreman lived in the big house of the rancher. There he took a quantity of equipment from a closet and flung it on the bed. Over 3 selections he lingered long. First was the cartridge belt, and he tried over several with conscientious care until he found the one which received the cartridges with the greatest ease. He could flip them out in the night automatically as a pianist fingers the scale in the dark. Next he examined lariats painfully, inch by inch, as though he were going to rope the staunchest steer that ever roamed the range. Already he knew that those ropes were sound and true throughout, but he took no chances now. One of the ropes he discarded because 1 or 2 of the strands in it were, or might be, a trifle frayed. The others he took alternately and whirled with a broad loop standing in the center of the room. Of the set, one was a little more supple, a little more durable, it seemed. This he selected and coiled swiftly. Last of all he lingered, and longest, over his revolvers. 6 in all, he set them out in a row along the bed, and without delay threw out 2 to begin with. Then he fingered the others, tried their weight and balance, slipped cartridges into the cylinders and extracted them again, whirled the cylinders, examined the minutest parts of the action. They were all such guns as an expert would have turned over with shining eyes, but finally he threw one aside into the discard. The cylinder revolved just a little too hard. Another was abandoned after much handling of the remaining 3, because to the delicate touch of Nash it seemed that the weight of the barrel was a gram more than in the other 2. But after this selection it seemed that there was no possible choice between the final 2. So he stood in the center of the room and went through a series of odd gymnastics. Each gun in turn he placed in the holster and then jerked it out, spinning it on the trigger guard around his second finger, while his left hand shot diagonally across his body and fanned the hammer. Still he could not make his choice, but he would not abandon the effort. It was an old maxim with him that there was in all the world one gun which was the best of all, and with which even the novice can become a killer. He tried walking away, whirling as he made his draw and leveling the gun on the doorknob. Then, without moving his hand, he lowered his head and squinted down the sights. In each case the bead was drawn to a center shot. Last of all he weighed each gun. One seemed a trifle lighter, the merest shade lighter than the other. This he slipped into the holster and carried the rest of his apparatus back to the closet from which he had taken it. Still the preparation had not ended. Filling his cartridge belt, every cartridge was subject to a rigid inspection. A full half hour was wasted in this manner, wasted because he rejected not one of the many he examined. Yet he seemed happier after having made his selection, and went down the stairs humming softly. Out to the barn he went, lantern in hand. This time he made no comparison of the horses, but went directly to an ugly-headed roan, long of leg, vicious of eye, thin-shouldered, and with hips that slanted sharply down. No one with knowledge of fine horseflesh could have looked on this brute without aversion. It did not have even size in its favor. A wild, free spirit, perhaps, might be the reason, but the animal stood with hanging head and pendant lower lip, One eye was closed and the other half open. A blind affection, then, made him go to this horse first of all. No, his greeting was to jerk his knee sharply into the ribs of the roan, which answered with a grunt and swung its head around with bared teeth like an angry dog. "Damn your eyes!" roared the hoarse voice of Steve Nash. "Stand still, or I'll knock you for a goal." The ears of the mustang flattened close to its neck, and a devil of hate came up in its eyes, but it stood quiet while Nash went about at a judicious distance and examined all the vital points. The hoofs were sound, and the backbone prominent, but not a high ridge from famine or much hard riding. The indomitable hate in the eyes of the mustang seemed to please the cowpuncher. It was a struggle to bridle the beast, which was accomplished only by grinding the points of his knuckles into the tender parts of the jowl to make the locked teeth open. In saddling, the knee came into play again, rapping the ribs of the brute repeatedly before the wind, which swelled out the chest to false proportions, was expelled in a sudden grunt, and the cinch whipped up taut. After that, Nash dodged the flying heels, chose his time, and vaulted into the saddle. The mustang trotted quietly out of the barn. Perhaps he had had his fill of bucking on that treacherous, slippery wood floor, but once outside he turned loose the full assortment of the cattle pony's tricks. It was only 10 minutes, but while it lasted the cursing of Nash was loud and steady, mixed with the crack of his murderous quirt against the roan's flanks. The bucking ended as quickly as it had begun, and they started at a long canter over the trail. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Trailin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Rowdy Delaney, Idaho, USA. Trailin by Max Brand. Chapter 12. The First Day. Mile after mile of the rough trail fell behind him, and still the pony shambled along at a loose trot or a swinging canter. The steep upgrades it took at a steady jog, and where the slopes pitched sharply down, it wound among the rocks with a faultless sureness of foot. Certainly the choice of Nash was well made. An Eastern horse of blood over a level course could have covered the same distance in half the time, but it would have broken down after 10 miles of that hard trail. Dawn came while they wound over the crest of the ridge, and with the sun in their faces they took the downgrade. It was well into the morning before Nash reached Logan. He forced from his eye the contempt with which all cattlemen feel for sheep herders. "I suppose you're here askin' after Bard," began Logan without the slightest preamble. "Bard? Who's he?" Logan considered the other with a sardonic smile. "Maybe you been ridin' all night jest for fun." "If you start usin' your tongue on me, Logan, you'll wear out the snapper on it. I'm on my way to the A Circle Y. Listen, I'm all for old man Drew. You know that. Tell me what Bard has on him." "Never heard the name before. Did he rustle a couple of your sheep?" Logan went on patiently. "I knew something was wrong when Drew was here yesterday, but I didn't think it was as bad as this." "What did Drew do yesterday?" "Came up as usual to potter around the old house, I guess. But when he heard about Bard bein' here, he changed his mind sudden and went home." "That's damn queer. What sort of lookin' feller is this Bard?" "I don't suppose you know, eh?" queried Logan ironically. "I don't suppose the old man described him before you started, maybe." "Logan, you're a poor old homesick maverick. Do you think I'm on somebody's trail? Don't you know I've been through with that sort of game for a hell of a while? When rocks turn into ham and eggs, I'll trust you, Steve. I'll tell you what I done to Bard anyway. Yesterday, after he found that Drew had been here and gone, he seemed sort of upset. Tried to keep it from me. But I'm too used to judgin' changes of the weather to be fooled by any tenderfoot ever used school English. Then he hinted around about learnin' the way to Kildare, because he knows that town is pretty close to Drew's place, I guess. I told him, sure I did. He should have gone due west, but I sent him south. There is a south trail, only it takes about 3 days to get to Kildare." Maybe you think that interests me. It don't." Logan overlooked this rejoinder, saying, "Is it his scalp you're after?" "Your ideas are like nest eggs, Logan, and you set over 'em like a hen. They look like eggs, they feel like eggs, but they don't never hatch. That's the way with your ideas. They look all right, they sound all right, but they don't mean nothin'. So long." But Logan merely chuckled. He had been long on the range. Nash turned his pony and trotted off in the direction of the Circle Y. The sheepherder called after him: "What you say cuts both ways, Steve. This feller Bard, he looks like a tenderfoot, he sounds like a tenderfoot, but he ain't a tenderfoot." Feeling that this parting shot gave him the honors of the meeting, he turned away, whistling with such spirit that one of his dogs, overhearing, stood still and gazed at his master with head cocked wisely to one side. His eastern course Nash pursued for a mile or more, and then he swung sharply to the south. He was weary, like his horse, and he made no attempt to start a sudden burst of speed. He let the pony go on at the same tireless jog, clinging like a bulldog to the trail. About midday he sighted a small house cuddled into the hollow of the hills and made toward it. As he dismounted, a tow-headed, spindly boy lounged out of the doorway and stood with his hands shoved carelessly in his little overall pockets. "Hello, young feller." "'Lo, stranger. What's the chance of bunkin' here for 3 or 4 hours and gettin' a good feed for the hoss?" "Never better. Gimme the hoss. I'll put him in the shed. Feed him grain." "No, you won't put him up. I'll tend to that." "Looks like a bad 'un." "That's it." "But a sure goer, eh?" "Yep." He led the pony into the shed, unsaddled him, and gave him a small feed. The horse first rolled on the dirt floor and then started methodically on his fodder. Having made sure that his mount was not off his feed, Nash rolled a cigarette and strolled back to the house with the boy. "Where's the folks?" he asked. "Ma's sick a little and didn't get up today. Pa's down to the corral, cussin' mad, but I can cook you up some chow." "All right, son. I got $1 here that'll buy you a pretty good store knife." The boy flushed so red that by contrast his straw-colored hair seemed positively white. "Maybe you want to pay me?" he suggested fiercely. "Maybe you think we're squatters that run a hotel?" Recognizing the true Western breed even in this small addition, Nash grinned. "Speakin' man to man, son, I didn't think that, but I thought I'd sort of feel my way. Which I'll say you're lucky you didn't try to feel your way with Pa, not the way he's feelin'." In the shack of the house he placed the best chair for Nash and set about frying ham and making coffee. This with crackers formed the meal. He watched Nash eat for a moment of solemn silence, and then the foreman looked up to catch a meditative chuckle from the youngster. "Let me in on the joke, son." "Nothin'. I was just thinkin' of Pa." "What's he sore about? Come out short at poker lately?" "No, he lost a hoss. Ha ha ha." He explained. "He lost his only standin' joke, and now the laugh's on him." Nash sipped his coffee and waited. On the mountain desert one does not draw out a narrator with questions. "There was a feller come along this morning on a lame horse," the story began. "He was a sure enough tenderfoot, leastwise he looked it and he talked it, but he wasn't." The familiarity of this description made Steve sit up a trifle straighter. "Was he a ringer?" "Maybe. I dunno. Pa meets him at the door and asks him in. What do you think this feller comes back with?" The boy paused to remember, and then, with twinkling eyes, he mimicked: "That's very good of you, sir, but I'll only stop to make a trade with you. This horse and some cash to boot for a durable mount out of your corral. The brute has gone lame, you see." Pa waited and scratched his head while these words sort of sunk in. Then he says, very smooth: "I'll let you have the best hoss I've got, and I won't ask much cash to boot." I began wonderin' what Pa was drivin' at, but I didn't say nothin', just held myself together and waited. "Look over there to the corral," says Pa and pointed. "They's a hoss there that ought to take you wherever you want to go. It's the best hoss I've ever had." It was the best horse Pa ever had, too. It was a piebald pinto called Joe, after my cousin Josiah, who's just a plain bad 'un and raises hell when there's any excuse. The piebald, he didn't even need an excuse. You see, he's one of them hosses likes company. When he leaves the corral he likes to have another hoss for a runnin' mate, and he was just as tame as anything. I could ride him. Anybody could ride him. But if you take him outside the bars of the corral without company, first thing he done was see if one of the other horses was comin' out to join him. When he seen that he was all laid out to make a trip by himself, he just naturally started to raise hell. Which Joe can raise more hell for his size than any hoss I ever seen. He's what you call an edicated bucker. He don't fool around with no pauses. He just starts in and figures out a situation and then gets busy sliding the gent that's on him off in the saddle. And he always used to win out. In fact, he was known for it all around these parts. He begun nice and easy, but he worked up to a fiddler playin' a favorite piece, and the end was the rider lying on the ground. Whenever the boys round here wanted any excitement, they used to come over and try their hands with Joe. We used to keep a pile of areca and stuff like that around to rub them up with and tame down the bruises after Joe laid 'em cold on the ground. There wasn't never anybody could ride that hoss when he started out alone. Well, this tenderfoot, he looks over the hoss in the corral and says, "That's a pretty fine mount, it seems to me. What do you want to boot?" $25 is enough," says Pa. "All right," says the tenderfoot, "here's the money." And he counts it out in Pa's hand. He says, "What a little beauty. It would be a treat to see him work on a polo field." Pa says, "It'd be a treat to see this hoss work anywhere." Then he steps on my foot to make me wipe the grin off my face. Down goes the tenderfoot and takes his saddle and flops it on the piebald pinto, and the piebald was just as nice as milk. Then he leads him out of the corral and gets on. First the pinto takes a look over his shoulder like he's waitin' for one of his pals among the hosses to come along, but he didn't see none. Then the circus started, and believe me, it was some circus. Joe hadn't had much action for some time, and he must 'a' used that weight thinkin' up new ways of raisin' hell. There ain't enough words in the Bible to describe what he done, which maybe you sort of gather that he had to keep on performin', because the tenderfoot was still in the saddle. He was. And he never pulled leather. No, sir, he never touched the bucking strap, but just sat there with his teeth set and his lips twisted back, the same smile he had when he got into the saddle. But pretty soon I suppose Joe had a chance to figure out that it didn't do him no particular harm to be alone. The minute he seen that he stopped fightin' and started off at a gallop, the way the tenderfoot wanted him to go, which was over there. "Damn my eyes," says Pa, and couldn't do nothin' about it but just stand there repeatin' that with variations, because with Joe gone there wouldn't be no drawin' card to get the boys round the house no more. "But you're lookin' sort of sleepy, stranger." "I am," answered Nash. "Well, if you'd seen that show you wouldn't be thinkin' of sleep, not for some time." "Maybe not, but the point is I didn't see it. Do you mind if I turn in on that bunk over there?" "Help yourself," said the boy. "What time do you want me to wake you up?" "Never mind, I wake up automatic. So long, Bud." He stretched out on the blankets and was instantly asleep. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Trailin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Rowdy Delaney, Idaho, USA. Trailin by Max Brand. Chapter 13. A Touch of Crimson. At the end of 3 hours he awoke sharply as though an alarm clock were clamoring at his ear. There was no elaborate preparation for renewed activities. A single yawn and stretch and he was again on his feet. Since the boy was not in sight he cooked himself an enormous meal, devoured it, and went out to the mustang. The roan greeted him with a volley of both heels that narrowly missed the head of Nash, but the cowpuncher merely smiled tolerantly. "Feeling fit again, eh? Damn your soul," he said genially. and picking up a bit of board fallen from the side of the shed, he smote the mustang mightily along the ribs. The mustang, as if it recognized the touch of the master, pricked up his ears and sidestepped. The brief rest had filled it with all the old vicious energy. For once more, as they rode clear of the door, there ensued a furious struggle between man and beast. The man won, as always, and the roan, dropping both ears flat against its neck, trotted sullenly out across the hills. In the monotony of the landscape, 1 mile exactly like another, no landmarks to guide him, no trail to follow, however faintly worn, it was strange to see the cowpuncher strike out through the vast distances of the mountain desert with as much confidence as if he were traveling on a paved city street. He had no compass to direct him, but he seemed to know his way as surely as the birds know the untracked paths of the air in the seasons of migration. Straight on through the afternoon and during the long evening he kept up his course at the same varying dog trot until the flush of sunset faded to a stern gray and the purple hills in the distance turned blue with shadows. Then, catching a glimmer of light on the hillside, he turned toward it and put up for the night. In answer to his call, a big man with a lantern came to the door and raised his light until it shone on a red, bald head and a portly figure. His welcome was neither hearty nor cold. Hospitality is expected in the mountain desert, so Nash put his horse in the shed and came back to the house. The meal was half over, but 2 girls immediately set a plate heaped with fried potatoes and bacon and flanked by a mighty cup of jet black coffee on one side and a pile of yellow biscuits on the other. He nodded to them, grunted by way of expressing thanks, and sat down to eat. Besides the tall father and the rosy-faced mother, the family consisted of 2 girls, one of them with her hair twisted severely close to her head, wearing a man's blue cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled up to a pair of brown elbows. Evidently she was the boy in the family, and to her fell the duties of performing the innumerable chores of the ranch, for her hands were thick with work, and the tips of her fingers blunted. Also, she had that calm, satisfied eye which belongs to the working man who knows that he has earned his meal. Her sister monopolized all the beauty and the grace. Not that she was either very pretty or extremely graceful, but she was instinct with the challenge of femininity like a rare scent. It lingered about her, it enveloped her ways, it gave light to her eyes and made her smile exquisite. Her clothes were not much finer material than her sister's, but they were cut to fit, and a bow of crimson ribbon at her throat was as effective in that environment as the most costly orchids on an evening gown. She was armed in pride this night, talking only to her mother, and then in monosyllables alone. At first it occurred to Steve that his coming made her self-conscious, but soon he discovered that the pride was directed at the third man at the table. She at least maintained a pretense of eating, but he made not even a sham, sitting miserably, his hard mouth set, his eyes shadowed by a tremendous frown. At length he shoved back his chair with such violence that the table trembled. "Well," he rumbled, "I guess this lets me out. So long." And he strode heavily from the room. A moment later his cursing came back to them as he rode into the night. "Takes it kind of hard, don't he?" said the father. The mother murmured, "Poor Ralph." "So you went and done it," said the mannish girl to her sister. "What of it?" snapped the other. "He's too good for you, that's what of it." "Girls!" exclaimed the mother anxiously. "Remember we got a guest." "Oh," said she with the strong brown arms, "I guess we can't tell him nothin'. I guess he had eyes to be seein' what's happened." She turned calmly to Steve. "Lizzie turned down Ralph Borden, poor feller." "Sue!" cried the other girl. "Well, after you done it, are you ashamed to have it talked about? You make me sore. I'll tell a man." "That's enough, Sue," growled her father. "What's enough?" "We ain't going to have no more show about this. I had my supper spoiled by it already." "I say it's a rotten shame," broke out Sue, and repeated, "Ralph's too good for her, and all because of a city dude, a tenderfoot." In the extremity of her scorn her voice drawled in a harsh manner. "Then you take him for yourself, if you can get him," cried Lizzie. I'm sure I don't want him." Their eyes blazed at each other across the table, and Lizzie, having scored an unexpected point, struck again. "I think you always had a sort of hankering for Ralph. Oh, I've seen your eyes rollin' at him." The other girl colored hotly through her tan. "If I was fond of him I wouldn't be ashamed to let him know. You can tell the world that. I wouldn't keep him trottin' about like a little pet dog till I got tired of him, and give him up for the sake of a greenhorn who," her voice lowered to a spiteful hiss, "kissed you the first time he ever seen you." In vain Lizzie fought for her control. Her lip trembled and her voice shook. "I hate you, Sue." "Sue, ain't you ashamed of yourself?" pleaded the mother. "No, I ain't. Think of it. Here's Ralph been sweet on Sue for 2 years, and now she gives him the go by for a skinny, affected dude like that feller that was here. And he's forgot you already, Liz, the minute he stopped laughin' at you for bein' so easy. Ma, are you goin' to let Sue talk like this, right before a stranger?" "Sue, you shut up," commanded the father. "I don't see nobody that can make me," said Sue, surly as a grown boy. "I can't make any more of a fool out of Liz than that tenderfoot made of her." "Did he," asked Steve, "ride a piebald mustang?" "Do you know him?" breathed Lizzie, forgetting the tears of shame which had been gathering in her eyes. "Nope. Just heard a little about him along the road." "What's his name?" Then the girl colored even before Sue could say spitefully, "Didn't he even tell you his name before he kissed you?" "He did. His name is Tony." "Tony?" in deep disgust. "Well, he's dark enough to be a dago. Maybe he's a foreign count or something, Liz, and he'll take you back to live in some castle or other." But the girl queried in spite of her badinage, "Do you know his name?" "His name," said Nash, thinking that it could do no harm to betray as much as this, "is Anthony Bard, I think." "And you don't know him?" "All I know is that the feller who used to own that piebald mustang is pretty mad and cusses every time he thinks of him." "He didn't steal the hoss?" This, with more bated breath than if the question had been, "He didn't kill a man," for indeed horse stealing was the greater crime. Even Nash would not make such an accusation directly, and therefore he fell back on an innuendo almost as deadly. "I dunno," he said noncommittally, and shrugged his shoulders. With all his soul he was concentrating on the picture of a man who conquered a fighting horse and flirted successfully with a pretty girl the same day, each time riding on swiftly from his conquest. The clues on this trail were surely thick enough, but they were of such a nature that the pleasant mind of Steve grew more and more thoughtful. Chapter 14. Chapter 14 of Trailin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Rowdy Delaney, Idaho, USA. Trailin by Max Brand. Chapter 14. Lemonade. In fact, so thoughtful had Nash become that he slept with extraordinary lightness that night and was up at the first hint of day. Sue appeared on the scene just in time to witness the last act of the usual drama of the bucking on the part of the roan, before it settled down to the mechanical dog trot with which it would wear out the ceaseless miles of the mountain desert all day and far into the night if need be. Nash swung more to the right, cutting across the hills, for he presumed that by this time the tenderfoot must have gotten his bearings and would head straight for Eldara. It was a stiff 2-day journey now, the whole first day's riding having been worse than a useless detour, so the bulldog jaw set harder and harder, and the keen eyes squinted as if to look into the dim future. Once each day, about noon, when the heat made even the desert and the men of the desert drowsy, he allowed his imagination to roam freely, counting the $1,000 over and over again, and tasting again the joys of a double salary. Yet even his hardy imagination rarely rose to the height of Sally Fortune. That hour of dreaming, however, made the day of labor almost pleasant. This time, in the very middle of his dream, he reached the Crossroads Saloon and General Merchandise Store of Flanders. So he banished his visions with a compelling shrug of his shoulders and rode for it at a gallop. A hot dryness grew in his throat at every stride. Quick service he was sure to get, for there were not more than half a dozen cattle ponies standing in front of the little building, with its rickety walls guiltless of paint save for the one great sign inscribed with uncertain letters. He swung from the saddle, tossed the reins over the head of the mustang, made a stride forward, and then checked himself with a soft curse and reached for his gun. For the door of the bar dashed open, and down the steps rushed a tall man with a yellow mustache, so long that it literally blew on either side of his shoulders as he ran. In either hand he carried a revolver, a two-gun man, fleeing perhaps from another murder. For Nash recognized in him a character notorious through 1,000 miles of the range. Sandy Ferguson, nicknamed by the color of his famous mustache, which was envied and dreaded so far and so wide. It was not fear that made Nash halt, for otherwise he would have finished the motion and whipped out his gun, but at least it was something closely akin to fear. For that matter, there were unmistakable signs in Sandy himself of what would have been called arrant terror in any other man. His face was so bloodless that the pallor showed through the leathery tan. One eye stared wildly, the other being sheltered under a clumsy patch which could not quite conceal the ugly bruise beneath. Under his great mustache his lips were puffed and swollen as the lips of a negro. Staggering in his haste, he whirled a few paces from the house and turned, his guns leveled. At the same moment the door opened and the perspiring figure of little fat Flanders appeared. Scorn and anger rather than hate or any bloodlust appeared on his face. His right arm, hanging loosely at his side, held a revolver, and he seemed to have the greatest unconcern for the leveled weapons of the gunman. He made a gesture with his armed hand, and Sandy winced as though a whiplash had flicked him. "Steady up, damn your eyes!" bellowed Flanders, "and put them guns away. Put 'em up, hear me?" To the mortal astonishment of Nash, Sandy obeyed, keeping the while a fascinated eye upon the little Dutchman. "Now climb on your hoss and beat it, and if I ever find you in reach again I'll send my kid out to rope you and give you a hoss whippin'." The gunfighter lost no time. A single leap carried him into the saddle, and he was off over the sand with a sharp rattle of beating hoofs. "Well," breathed Nash, "I'll be hanged." "Sure you will," suggested Flanders, at once changing his frown for a smile of somewhat professional good nature, as one who greeted an old customer. "Sure you will, unless you come in and have a drink on the house. I want something myself to forget what I been doing. I feel like the dog catcher." Steve, deeply meditative, strode into the room. "Partner," he said gravely to Flanders, "I've always prided myself on having eyes a little better than the next one, but just now I guess I must have been seeing double. Seemed to me that was Sandy Ferguson that you hot-footed out of the door, or has Sandy got a double?" "Nope," said the bartender, wiping the last of the perspiration off his forehead. "That's Sandy, all right." "Then gimme a big drink. I need it." The bottle spun expertly across the bar, and the glasses tinkled after. "Funny about him, all right," nodded Flanders, "but then it's happened the same way with others I could tell you about. As long as he was winnin', Sandy was the king of any roost. The minute he lost a fight, he wasn't worth so many pounds of salt pork. Take a hoss. A fine hoss is often just the same. Long as it wins, nothin' can touch some of them blooded boys. But let 'em go under the wire second, maybe just because they's packin' 20 pounds too much weight, and they're never any good any more. Any second rater can lick 'em. I lost 500 iron boys on a hoss that laid down like that." "All of which means," suggested Nash, "that Sandy has been licked." "Licked? No, he ain't been licked, but he's been plumb annihilated, washed off the map, cleaned out, faded, rubbed into the dirt. If there was some stronger way of puttin' it, I would. Only last night, at that. But now look at him. A girl that never seen a man before could tell that he wasn't any more dangerous than if he was made of putty. But if the fool keeps packin' them guns, he's sure to get into trouble." He raised his glass. "So here's to the man that Sandy was, and ain't no more." They drank solemnly. "Maybe you took the fall out of him yourself, Flanders?" "Nope, I ain't no fighter, Steve. You know that. The feller that downed Sandy was a tenderfoot. Yep, a greenhorn." "Ah," drawled Nash softly. "I thought so." "You did? Anyway, let's hear the story. Another drink on me, Flanders." "It was like this. Along about evening of yesterday Sandy was in here with a couple of the other boys. He was pretty well lighted. The glow was circulatin' promiscuous, in fact, when in comes a feller about your height, Steve, but lighter, good lookin', thin face, big dark eyes like a girl. He carried the signs of a long ride on him. Well, sir, he walks up to the bar and says, 'Can you make me a very sour lemonade, Mr. Bartender?' I grabbed the edge of the bar and hung tight. 'A which?' say I. 'Lemonade, if you please.' I rolled an eye at Sandy, who was standin' there with his jaw falling, and then I got busy with the lemons and the squeezer, but pretty soon Ferguson walked up to the stranger. 'Are you English?' he asks. I knew by his tone what was comin', so I slid the gun I keep behind the bar closer and prepared for a lot of damaged crockery. 'I?' says the tenderfoot. 'Why, no. What makes you ask?' 'Your damn funny way of talkin',' says Sandy. 'Oh,' says the greenhorn, nodding as if he was thinking this over and discovered a little truth in it. 'I suppose the way I talk is a little unusual.' 'A little rotten,' says Sandy. 'Did I hear you askin' for a lemonade?' 'You did.' 'Would I seem to be askin' too many questions?' says Sandy, terrible polite. 'If I inquires if bar whisky ain't good enough for you?' The tenderfoot, he stands there just as easy as you and me are now, and he laughed. He says, 'The bar whisky I've tasted around this country is not very good for anyone, unless, perhaps, after a snake has bitten you. Then it works on the principle of poison fight poison, eh?' Sandy says after a minute, 'I'm the most quietest, gentle, innercent cowpuncher that ever rode the range, but I'd tell a man that it riles me to hear good bar whisky insulted like this. Look at me. Do I look as if whisky ain't good for a man?' 'Why,' says the tenderfoot, 'you look sort of funny to me.' He said it as easy if he was passin' the morning with Ferguson. But I seen that was the last straw with Sandy. He hefted out both guns and trained them on the greenhorn. I yelled, 'Sandy, for God's sake, don't be killin' a tenderfoot.' 'If whisky will kill him, he's goin' to die,' says Sandy. 'Flanders, pour out a drink of rye for this gent.' I did, though my hand was shaking a lot, and the chap takes the glass and raises it polite and looks at the color of it. I thought he was goin' to drink, and starts wipin' the sweat from my forehead. But this chap, he sets down the glass and smiles over at Sandy. 'Listen,' he says, still grinnin'. 'In the old days I suppose this would have been a pretty bluff, but it won't work with me now. You want me to drink this very bad glass of whisky, but I'm sure you don't want it badly enough to shoot me. There are many reasons. In the old days a man shot down another and then rode off on his horse and was forgotten. But in these days the telegraph is faster than any horse that was ever foaled. They'd be sure to get you, sir, though you might dodge them for a while. And I believe that for a crime such as you threaten, they have recently installed a little electric chair, which is a perfectly good inducer of sleep. In fact, it's better than a cradle. Taking these things all into consideration, I take it for granted that you are bluffing, my friend, and one of my favorite occupations is calling a bluff. You look dangerous, but I've an idea that you're as yellow as your mustache.' Sandy, he sort of swelled up all over like a poisoned dog. He says, 'I begin to see your style. You want a clean manhandlin', which suits me uncommon well.' With that, he lays down his guns, soft and careful, and puts up his fists, and he goes after the other gent. He makes his pass, which should have sent the other gent into kingdom come, but it didn't. No, sir, the tenderfoot, he seemed to evaporate. He wasn't there when the first fist of Ferguson came along. Ferguson, he checked up short and wheeled around and charged again like a bull, and he missed again. And so they kept on playin' a sort of game of tag over the place, the stranger just sidesteppin' like a prize fighter, the prettiest you ever seen, and not developin' when Sandy started one of his swings. At last one of Sandy's fists grazed him on the shoulder and sort of peeved him, it looked like. He ducks under Sandy's next punch, steps in, and wallops Sandy over the eye. That punch didn't travel more'n 6 inches, but it slammed Sandy down in the corner like he's been shot. He was too surprised to be much hurt, though, and drags himself up to his feet, making a pass at his pocket at the same time. Then he came again, silent and thinking of blood, I suppose, with a knife in his hand. This time the tenderfoot didn't wait. He went in with sort of a hitch step, like a dancer. Ferguson's knife carved air beside the tenderfoot's head, and then the skinny boy jerked up his right and his left, 1-2, into Sandy's mouth. Down he goes again, slumps down as if all the bones in his body was busted, right down on his face. The other feller grabs his shoulder and jerks him over on his back. He stands looking down at him for a moment, and then he says, sort of thoughtful, "He isn't badly hurt, but I suppose I shouldn't have hit him twice." Can you beat that, Steve? You can't. When Sandy come to, he got to his feet, wobbling, seen his guns, went over and scooped 'em up, with the eye of the tenderfoot on him all the time, scooped 'em up, stood with 'em all poised, and so he backed out through the door. It wasn't any pretty thing to see. The tenderfoot, he turned to the bar again. "If you don't mind," he says, "I think I'll switch my order and have that whiskey instead. I seem to need it." "Son," I says, "there ain't nothin' in the house that you can't have for the askin'. Try some of this." And I pulled out a bottle of my private stock. You know the stuff. I've had it 25 years, and it was 10 years old when I got it. That ain't as much a lie as it sounds. He takes a glass of it and sips it, sort of suspicious, like a wolf scentin' the wind for elk in winter. Then his face lighted up like a lantern had been flashed on it. You'd 'a' thought he was lookin' his long lost brother in the eye from the way he smiled at me. He holds the glass up and lets the light come through it, showin' the little traces and bubbles of oil. "May I know your name?" he says. It made me feel like Rockerbilt, hearin' him say that in that special voice. "Me," says I, "I'm Flanders." "It's an honor to know you, Mr. Flanders," he says. "My name is Anthony Bard." We shook hands, and his grip was 3/4 man, I'll tell the world. "Good liquor," he says, "is like a fine lady. Only a gentleman can appreciate it. I drink to you, sir." So that's how Sandy Ferguson went under the sod. Today, well, I couldn't let Ferguson stand in a bar room where a gentleman had been, could I? End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Trailin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Rowdy Delaney, Idaho, USA. Trailin by Max Brand. Chapter 15. The Darkness in Eldara. Even the stout roan grew weary during the third day, and when they topped the last rise of hills and looked down to the darker shadows in Eldara, in the black heart of the hollow, the mustang stood with hanging head and one ear flopped forward. Cruel indeed had been the pace which Nash maintained, yet they had never been able to overhaul the flying piebald of Anthony Bard. As they trotted down the slope, Nash looked to his equipment, handled his revolver, felt the strands of the lariat, and resting only his toes in the stirrups, eased all his muscles to make sure they were uncramped from the long journey. He was fit, there was no doubt of that. Coming down the main street, for Eldara boasted no fewer than 3 thoroughfares, the first houses which Nash passed showed no lights. As far as he could see, the blinds were all drawn. Not even a glimmer of a candle showed, and the voices which he heard were muffled and low. He thought of plague or some other disaster which might have overtaken the little village and wiped out 9/10 of the populace in a day. Only such a thing could account for the silence in Eldara. There should have been bursts and roars of laughter here and there, and now and then a harsh stream of cursing. There should have been clatter of kitchen tins. There should have been neighing horses. There should have been the quiver and tingle of children's voices at play in the dusty streets. But there was none of this. The silence was thick and oppressive as the unbroken dark of night. Even Butler's saloon was closed. This, however, was something which he would not believe, no matter what the testimony of his eyes gave him. He rode up to a shuttered window and kicked it with his heel. Only the echoes of that racket replied to him from the interior of the place. He swore, somewhat touched with awe, and kicked again. A faint voice called, "Who's there?" "Steve Nash. What the devil's happened to Eldara?" The boards of the shutter stirred, opened so that the man within could look out. "Is it Steve? Honest?" "Damn it, Butler, don't you know my voice? What's turned Eldara into a cemetery?" "Cemetery's right. Butch Conklin and his gang are going to raid the place tonight." "Butch Conklin?" And Nash whistled long and low. "But why the devil don't the boys get together, if they know Butch is coming with his gunmen?" "That's what they've done. Every able-bodied man in town is out in the hills trying to surprise Conklin's gang before they hit town with their guns going." Butler was a one-legged man, so Nash kept back the question which naturally formed in his mind. "How do they know Conklin is coming? Who gave the tip?" "Conklin himself." "What? Has he been in town?" "Right. Came in roaring drunk." "Why'd they let him get away again?" "Because the sheriff's a bonehead, and because our marshal is solid ivory. That's why." "What happened?" "Butch came in drunk, as I was saying, which he generally is. But he wasn't giving no trouble, and nobody felt particular called on to cross him and ask questions. He was real sociable, in fact. That's how the mess was started." "Go on. I don't get your drift." "Everybody was treatin' Butch like he was king of the earth, and not passin' out any back talk, all except one tenderfoot." But here a stream of tremendous profanity burst from Nash. It rose, it rushed on. It seemed an exhaustless vocabulary built up by long practice on mustangs and cattle. At length, "Is that damn fool in Eldara? Do you know him?" "No." "Anyway, go on. What happened?" "I was sayin' that Butch was feelin' pretty sociable. It went all right in the bars. He was in here and didn't do nothin' wrong. Even paid for all the drinks for everybody in the house, which nobody could have asked more even from a white man. But then Butch got hungry and went up the street to Sally Fortune's place." A snarl came from Nash. "Did they let that swine go in there?" "Who'd stop him? Would you?" "I'd try my damnedest." "Anyway, he went in and got the center table and called for $10 worth of bacon and eggs, which there hasn't been an egg in Eldara this week. Sally, she told him, not being afraid even of Butch. He got pretty sore at that and said that it was a frame-up and everyone was agin him. But finally he allowed that if she'd sit down to the table and keep him company, he'd manage to make out on whatever her cook had ready to eat." "And Sally done it?" groaned Nash. "Sure, it was like a dare, and you know Sally. She'd risk her whole place any time for the sake of a bet." "I know it, but don't rub it in." "She fetched out a steak and served Butch as if he had been a king, and then sat down beside him and started kiddin' him along, with all a gang of us sittin' or standin' around and laughin', fit to bust, but not loud for fear Butch would get annoyed. Then two things come in together and spoiled the prettiest little party that was ever started in Eldara. First was that player piano which Sally got shipped in, and paid God knows how much for. The second was the greenhorn I was tellin' you about." "Go on," said Nash, a little snarl coming back in his voice. "Tell me how that tenderfoot walked in and kicked Butch out of the place." "Somebody been tellin' you?" "No, I just been readin' the mind of Eldara. It was a nice play, though. This Bard, we found out later that was his name, walks in, takes a table, and not being served none too quick, he walks over and slips a nickel in the slot of the piano. Out she starts with a piece of rippin' ragtime. You know how loud it plays. Butch, he kept on talkin' for a minute, but he couldn't hear himself think. Finally he bellers, 'Who turned that damn tin pan loose?' This Bard walks up and bows. He says, 'Sir, I came in here to find food, and since I can't get service, I'll take music as a substitute.' Them's the words he used, Steve, honest to God. Used 'em to Butch. Well, Conklin was too flabbergasted to budge, and Bard, he leaned over and says to Sally, 'The floor is fairly smooth. Suppose you and I dance till I get a chance to eat.'" We didn't know whether to laugh or to cheer, but most of us compromised by keeping an eye on Butch's gun. Sally says, "Sure, I'll dance," and gets up. "Wait," Butch hollers. "Are you leavin' me for this wall-eyed galoot?" There ain't nothin' Sally loves more'n a fight, we all know that, but this time I guess she took pity on the poor tenderfoot. Or maybe she just didn't want to get her floor all messed up. "Keep your hat on, Butch," she says. "All I want to do is give him some motherly advice." "If you're acting that part," says Bard, calm as you please, "I've got to tell mother that she's been keepin' some pretty bad company." "Some what?" bellers Butch, not believin' his ears. And young Bard, he steps around the girl and stands over Butch. "Bad company is what I said," he repeats, "but maybe I can be convinced." "Easy," says Butch, and reaches for his gun. We all dived for the door, but me bein' held up on account of my missing leg, I was slow and couldn't help seein' what happened. Butch was fast, but the young feller was faster. He had Butch by the wrist before the gun came clear. Just gave a little twist, and there he stood with the gun in his hand pointin' into Butch's face, and Butch sittin' there like a feller in a trance or wakin' up out of a bad dream. Then he gets up, slow and dignified, though he had enough liquor in him to float a ship. "I been mobbed," he says. "It's easy to see that. I come here peaceful and quiet, and here I been mobbed. But I'm comin' back, boys, and I ain't comin' alone." There was our chance to get him while he was walkin' out of the place without a gun, but somehow nobody moved for him. He didn't look none too easy, even without his shootin' irons. Out he goes into the night, and we stood around staring at each other. Everybody was upset except Sally and Bard. He says, "Misfortune, this is our dance, I think." "Excuse me," says Sally, "I almost forgot about it." And they started to dance to the piano, waltzing around among the tables. The rest of us lit out for home because we knew that Butch would be on his way with his gang before we could get very far under cover. "But hey, Steve, where you goin'?" "I'm goin' to get in on that dance," called Nash, and was gone at a racing gallop down the street. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of Trailin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Rowdy Delaney, Idaho, USA. Trailin by Max Brand. Chapter 16. Bluff. He found no dance in progress, however, but in the otherwise empty eating place, which Sally owned and ran with her two capable hands, and the assistance of a cook, sat Sally herself dining at the same table with the tenderfoot, the flirt, the horsebreaker, the tamer of gunfighters. Nash stood in the shadow of the doorway watching that lean, handsome face with the suggestion of mockery in the eyes, and the trace of sternness around the thin lips. Not a formidable figure by any means, but since his experiences of the past few days, Nash was grown extremely thoughtful. What he finally thought he caught in the most unusual tenderfoot was a certain alertness of a more or less hair-trigger variety. Even now, as he sat at ease at the table, one elbow resting upon it lightly, apparently enwrapped in the converse of Sally Fortune, Nash had a consciousness that the other might be on his feet and in the most distant part of the room within a second. What he noted in the second instant of his observation was that Sally was not at all loath to waste her time on the stranger. She was eating with a truly formidable conventionality of manner, and a certain grace with which she raised the ponderous coffee cup, made of crockery guaranteed to resist all falls, struck awe through the heart of the cowpuncher. She was bent on another conquest, beyond all doubt, and that she would not make it never entered the thoughts of Nash. He set his face to banish a natural scowl and advanced with a good-natured smile into the room. "Hello," he called. "It's old Steve," sang out Sally, and whirling from her chair, she advanced at almost a run to meet him, caught him by both hands, and led him to a table next to that at which she had been sitting. It was as gracefully done as if she had been welcoming a brother. But Nash, knowing Sally, understood perfectly that it was only a play to impress the eye of Bard. Nevertheless, he was forced to accept it in good part. "My old pal Steve Nash," said Sally, "and this is Mr. Anthony Bard." Just the faintest accent fell on the "Mr.," but it made Steve wince. He rose and shook hands gravely with the tenderfoot. "I stopped at Butler's place down the street," he said, "and been hearin' a pile about a little play you made a while ago. It was about time somebody called old Butch's bluff." "Bluff?" cried Sally indignantly. "Bluff?" queried Bard, with a slight raising of the eyebrows. "Sure. Bluff. Butch wasn't any more dangerous than a cat with trimmed claws. But I guess you seen that." He settled down easily in his chair, just as Sally resumed her place opposite Bard. "Steve," she said with a quiet venom, "that bluff of his has been as good as a four of a kind with you for a long time. I never seen you make any play at Butch." He returned amiably: "Like to sit here and have a nice social chat, Sally, but I gotta be gettin' back to the ranch, and in the meantime I'm sure hungry." At the reminder of business a green light came in the fine blue eyes of Sally. They were her only really fine features, for the nose tilted an engaging trifle, the mouth was a little too generous, the chin so strong it gave in moments of passivity an air of sternness to her face. That sternness was exaggerated as she rose, keeping her glare fixed upon Nash, a thing impossible for him to bear, so he lowered his eyes and engaged in rolling a cigarette. She turned back to Bard. "Sorry I got to go before I finish eating, but business is business." "And sometimes," suggested Bard, "a bore." It was an excellent opening for a quarrel, but Nash was remembering religiously a certain $1,000, and also a gesture of William Drew when he seemed to be breaking an imaginary twig. So he merely lighted his cigarette and seemed to have heard nothing. "The whole town," he remarked casually, "seems scared stiff by this Butch, but of course he ain't comin' back tonight." "I suppose," said the tenderfoot after a cold pause, "that he will not." But the coldness reacted like the most genial warmth upon Nash. He had chosen a part detestable to himself but necessary to his business. He must be a grabber for the nonce, a free talker, a chatterer, who would cover up all pauses. "Kind of strange to ride into a dark town like this," he began, "but I could tell you a story about—" "Oh, Steve!" called the voice of Sally from the kitchen. He rose and nodded to Bard. "'Scuse me, I'll be back in a minute." "Thanks," answered the other with a somewhat grim emphasis. In the kitchen Sally spoke without prelude. "What deviltry are you up to now, Steve?" "Me?" he repeated with eyes widened by innocence. "What do you mean, Sally?" "Don't fourflush me, Steve. Is eating in your place deviltry?" "Am I blind?" she answered hotly. "Have I got spring halt, maybe? You're too polite, Steve. I can always tell when you're on the way to a little belle of your own making, by the way you get sort of kind and warmed up. What is it now? Kiss me, Sally, and I'll tell you why I came to town." She said with a touch of color, "I'll see you," and then, changing quickly, she slipped inside his ready arms with a smile and tilted up her face. "Now what is it, Steve?" "This," he answered. "What do you mean?" "You know me, Sally. I've worn out the other ways of raising hell, so I thought I'd start a little by coming to Eldara to kiss you." Her open hand cracked sharply twice on his lean face, and she was out of his arms. He followed, laughing, but she armed herself with a red-hot frying pan and defied him. "You ain't even a good sport, Steve. I'm done with you." "Kiss you?" He said calmly: "I see hell is startin', all right." But she changed at once and smiled up at him. "I can't stay mad at you, Steve. I suppose it's because of your nerve. I want you to do something for me." "What? Is that a way to take it? I've asked you a favor, Steve." He said suspiciously: "It's got something to do with that tenderfoot in the room out there." It was a palpable hit, for she colored sharply. Then she took the bull by the horns. "What if it is?" "Sally, do you mean to tell me you've fallen for that cheap line of lingo he passes out?" "Steve, don't try to kid me." "Why? You know who he is, don't you?" "Sure. Anthony Bard." "And do you know who Anthony Bard is?" "Well, she asked with some anxiety. "Well, if you don't know, you can find out. That's what the last girl done." She wavered and then blinked her eyes as if she were resolved to shut out the truth. "I ask you to do me a favor, Steve. And I will, you know that. I want you to see that Bard gets safe out of this town. Sure, nothing I'd rather do." She tilted her head a little to one side and regarded him wistfully. "Are you double crossing me, Steve? Why do you suspect me? Haven't I said I'd do it?" "But you said it too easy." The gentleness died in her face. She said sternly, "If you do double cross me, you'll find I'm about as hard as any man on the range. Get me? Shake." Their hands met. After all, he did not guarantee what would happen to the tenderfoot after they were clear of town. Perhaps this was a distinction a little too fine for the downright mind of a girl. A sea of troubles besieged the mind of Nash. And to let the sea subside, he wandered back to the eating room and found the tenderfoot finishing his coffee. The latter kept an eye of frank suspicion on him. So the silence held for a brooding moment, until Bard asked, "Do you know the way to the ranch of William Drew?" It was a puzzler to Nash. Was not that his job, to go out and bring the man to Drew's place? Here he was, already on his way. He remembered just in time that the manner of the bringing was decidedly qualified. He said aloud, "The way? Sure, I work on Drew's place." "Really?" "Yep, foreman. You don't happen to be going back that way tonight?" "Not all the way. Part of it. Mind if I went along?" "Nobody to keep you from it," said the cowpuncher without enthusiasm. "By the way, what sort of man is Drew? Don't you know him?" "No. The reason I want to see him is because I want to get the right to do some fishing and hunting on a place of his on the other side of the range. The place with the old house on it. The place Logan is." "Exactly. I also wish to see Logan again. I've got several little things I'd like him to explain." Grunted Nash without apparent interest. "And Drew? He's a big feller, big and gray." "Ah," said the other, and drew a breath as though he were drinking. It seemed to Nash that he had never seen such an unpleasant smile. "You'll get what you want out of Drew. He's generous." "I hope so," nodded the other with far off eyes. "I've got a lot to ask of him." Chapter 17